Imagine burying a $3 clay pot in your garden and never worrying about watering again. Not for a day, not for a week, sometimes not for an entire month. No Wi-Fi controller, no drip lines, no batteries. Just a pot, some soil, and a secret that 4,000 years of human civilization already figured out, and that a $26 billion industry has spent decades making sure you forget. Here's what nobody tells you. Up to 70% of the water you pour onto your garden today evaporates before a single root ever touches it. 70%. You are literally watering the air. And while you keep buying timers, moisture sensors, and expensive irrigation kits, farmers in ancient Persia were solving this exact problem with nothing more than unglazed clay and the physics of thirst. This technology is called Ollas irrigation. It has been found on 3 separate continents, invented independently by civilizations that never spoke to each other. And yet every single one of them arrived at the same answer. That's not coincidence. That's the universe trying to tell you something. The question is, why did we stop listening? And more importantly, who benefits from your forgetting? Stay with me, because what you're about to learn will change the way you look at every hose, every sprinkler, and every smart watering product you've ever bought. The story begins not in a laboratory, not in a university greenhouse, but in the cracked, sun-baked earth of ancient Persia around 2000 BCE. Archaeologists excavating sites across modern-day Iran discovered something unexpected buried just beneath the soil surface. Rows of unglazed clay vessels, sealed at the top, positioned at precise intervals between crop rows. At first, researchers assumed they were storage containers. Then they looked closer. The pots were deliberately porous, deliberately unglazed, deliberately placed where roots would grow. These were not storage vessels. These were irrigation systems. The Persians called them ola, a word that simply meant pot. But what they had engineered was anything but simple. They had discovered that unglazed terracotta, fired at just the right temperature, becomes semi-permeable. Water molecules can pass through its walls slowly, steadily, silently. No pump required, no timer required. The pot sweats, the soil drinks, the roots follow the moisture like a map. For the farmers of ancient Khorasan province, a single buried olah could sustain a fruit tree through weeks of desert drought, using nothing more than a jar of water refilled every few days. What makes this discovery even more extraordinary is what happened next, on the other side of the world, with no contact, no trade route, no shared language. In northern China, farmers along the Yellow River were independently burying clay pots between their millet crops as early as 100 BCE. Historian and agricultural archaeologist Dr. Xiaoming Zheng documented this practice in a 2003 paper published in Agricultural History, noting that Chinese farmers called the vessels pengguan and used them specifically to reduce water loss during dry seasons. The efficiency gains they recorded, passed down through generations of oral farming tradition, were described as dramatic. Same technology, different continent, different millennium, same result. Then came the Berber farmers of North Africa, the indigenous communities of the Sonoran Desert in Mexico, who called their version tinajas, and the agricultural communities of the Canary Islands, who refined the pot's neck design to slow evaporation even further. Every single one of these cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, converged on the same physical truth. The most intelligent irrigation system is one that lets the plant decide when it's thirsty. So what happened? How does a technology that crossed 4 continents and 4,000 years of human history simply vanish from our gardens? The answer arrives right on schedule. Around the late 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution began turning agriculture from a practice of knowledge into a marketplace of products. Cast iron pipes became available, municipal water systems expanded, and suddenly the people selling you water infrastructure had every reason to make you believe that ancient clay pots were primitive, inefficient, and beneath a modern gardener's dignity. The knowledge didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it was free. And free doesn't build a $26 billion industry. But before we get to who's been profiting from your forgetting, you need to understand the science of why this works. Because once you see the physics behind it, you'll never look at a watering can the same way again. Let's talk about who benefits when you don't know what you just learned. In 2023, the global smart irrigation market was valued at $26.4 billion. $26.4 billion. That number is not accidental. It is the financial architecture built on top of a single assumption that you need technology, electricity, and a monthly subscription to water your plants correctly. Companies like Rainbird, Hunter Industries, and Netafim have built empires selling you controllers, sensors, pressure regulators, and drip emitters. Each piece engineered not just to work, but to be replaced, upgraded, and expanded. The average home drip irrigation system costs between $200 and $500 to install. A Wi-Fi-enabled smart watering controller runs another $80 to $280. And the smart soil moisture sensors that tell your $26 billion industry when your plants are thirsty, another $30 to $150 each. A buried clay pot costs $3, sometimes less if you know where to look. That comparison is not just about money, it is about the systematic replacement of embodied knowledge with purchase dependency. For most of the 20th century, agricultural extension programs, funded partly by industrial partners, actively promoted mechanized irrigation as the modern, scientific, respectable approach. Traditional methods, including Olla irrigation, were categorized in textbooks as subsistence techniques used by people who simply didn't have access to better options yet. The framing was deliberate. If ancient equals primitive, then you will always be reaching for the new, and the new always costs more. Here is what those extension programs never told your grandparents. The $26.4 billion smart irrigation industry, for all its sensors and algorithms, still cannot replicate the fundamental mechanism that makes Ollas irrigation work. Every commercial drip system delivers water on a schedule. Yours are one programmed by a timer. It pushes water into soil whether the plant needs it or not. The result is a system optimized for human convenience, not plant biology. And that distinction, invisible in a product brochure, is the difference between watering a plant and feeding it. To be honest, and this matters, Ollas irrigation is not a perfect solution for every garden. It requires you to refill the pots regularly, which in very hot climates during peak summer can mean every 2 to 3 days for smaller vessels. It is less effective in extremely coarse, sandy soils where water disperses too rapidly before roots can access it. And scaling it to large commercial farmland, while possible, requires significant upfront labor for installation. These are real limitations. Any channel that tells you otherwise is selling you something just as hard as the drip irrigation companies are. But here is where the science becomes impossible to dismiss. A landmark study conducted by the University of Pretoria in 2007, one of the most cited pieces of modern Ollas research, measured water use efficiency across 3 irrigation methods: surface flooding, drip irrigation, and buried clay pot systems. The results were not close. Ollas irrigation reduced water consumption by 70% compared to surface watering and by 33% compared to commercial drip systems. Not in ancient Persia, not in a history book. In a peer-reviewed study published in the journal Irrigation Science, conducted with modern instrumentation and controlled variables. The global irrigation equipment market is projected to reach $36 billion by 2028, growing at nearly 6% per year. That growth depends entirely on you continuing to believe that the solution to water scarcity is more technology, not older wisdom. And with water stress now affecting over 40% of the global population, according to the United Nations 2023 Water Report, the stakes of that belief are no longer just about your garden. Someone is getting very rich while ancient knowledge sits buried, not in the ground where it belongs, but in the margins of history where it was deliberately pushed. And the most unsettling part? The science that proves Ollas works better than what they're selling you has been available for decades. So why haven't you heard about it until now? The answer lives in the physics of clay, and it is more elegant than anything a $280 Wi-Fi controller will ever do. To understand why a $3 clay pot outperforms a $280 smart irrigation system, you need to understand one deceptively simple concept. Plants do not want water pushed at them on a schedule. They want to pull water when they need it, and the entire mechanism of Ollas irrigation is built around that biological truth. The physics begins with something called capillary suction, or negative pore pressure. When soil around a plant's root zone begins to dry out, tiny air pockets form between soil particles. Those air pockets create a measurable suction force, a negative pressure gradient that pulls moisture from any available wet source toward the dry zone. This is not metaphor. This is physics. The same force that pulls water up through a paper towel when you touch its edge to a puddle is the same force that pulls water through the walls of a buried olla toward a thirsty root system. The plant is not passive in this process. It is actively generating the demand signal, and the clay pot is simply responding to it. The key material is unglazed terracotta, specifically clay fired at temperatures between 900 and 100 degrees Celsius without any sealant or glaze applied to the outer surface. At this firing range, the clay retains a network of microscopic pores, each between 0.1 and 10 micrometers in diameter. Water molecules can pass through these pores, but only under pressure differential. When the surrounding soil is wet and at equilibrium, almost no water escapes the pot. When the soil dries and suction increases, the flow rate through the pot wall increases proportionally. The system is self-regulating in a way that no timer, no sensor, and no algorithm has ever fully replicated, because it is not programmed by human logic. It is governed by soil physics. This is where the research becomes impossible to ignore. The 2007 University of Pretoria study, led by soil scientist Dr. Henk Botha and published in Irrigation Science, tested Ollas systems against surface irrigation and commercial drip lines across tomato and pepper crops over 2 full growing seasons in semi-arid conditions. Olla irrigated plots used 70% less water than surface irrigated plots and 33% less than drip irrigated plots, while producing statistically equivalent yields. The plants were not stressed. They were not smaller. They were not less productive. They simply used dramatically less water to achieve the same result, because they were receiving water on their own biological schedule rather than a human-imposed one. A separate study published by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in 2010 analyzed Olla adoption across smallholder farms in sub-Saharan Africa and found that farmers using clay pot irrigation reported crop survival rates of 85 to 94% during drought periods, compared to 40 to 60% survival rates among neighboring farms using conventional surface irrigation with the same water supply. Those numbers represent real harvests, real families, real food security built on a $3 pot. Now here is where intellectual honesty requires a pause. Olla irrigation is not a universal solution, and presenting it as one would make this channel no different from the industry it is critiquing. The system underperforms in soils with very high sand content, specifically soils where more than 70% of composition is coarse sand, because water disperses laterally too fast before capillary suction can concentrate it in the root zone. It also requires consistent refilling. In climates exceeding 35 degrees Celsius with low humidity, a 2-liter Olla may need refilling every 48 to 72 hours during peak summer. And for large-scale commercial farming, installation labor costs can offset water savings in the short term, though long-term efficiency gains remain significant. But for a home garden, a raised bed, a backyard orchard, or a community plot in a water-stressed region, the physics are unambiguous. You are not fighting nature with a timer. You are cooperating with it through clay. And the moment you understand that distinction, the moment you see that the most advanced irrigation technology on your property might be something a Persian farmer figured out before the Roman Empire existed, something shifts in how you think about your garden and about who you've been trusting to tell you what it needs. That shift is exactly what we need to talk about next. Here is the moment I want you to stop and actually think about what you've been doing every time you've walked into a garden center. You picked up a bag of slow-release fertilizer. You looked at a drip irrigation kit in a box with a picture of lush tomatoes on the front. You read the label on a soil moisture meter and thought, maybe this is what my garden is missing. And somewhere in that aisle, surrounded by products designed to solve problems that older civilizations never had, you accepted a story about yourself, that you are a consumer of gardening technology, not a practitioner of gardening knowledge, that you need the product to complete you, that without the right equipment, you are somehow doing it wrong. That story is worth approximately $26.4 billion per year to the people who wrote it. But here is what is actually true about you. You are the descendant of people who fed entire civilizations without a single battery, without a single Wi-Fi signal, without a single drip emitter made from injection molded plastic. The farmers of ancient Persia who buried their first Ola in cracked desert soil were not primitive people making do with limited options. They were sophisticated observers of natural systems who understood something that a $280 smart controller still cannot replicate, that a plant's thirst is more intelligent than any schedule you can program. They trusted that intelligence, and their harvests survived droughts that would have collapsed a modern irrigation-dependent farm. Right now in the Sahel region of West Africa, smallholder farmers are reviving Olla irrigation, not as a historical curiosity, but as a survival strategy. In Niger and Burkina Faso, NGOs working with the FAO have documented communities where clay pot irrigation has restored crop production on land that had been written off as too arid to farm. These are not people romanticizing the past. They are people choosing the most effective tool available to them, and that tool costs less than a cup of coffee. In Mexico, indigenous Mixtec communities in Oaxaca never stopped using their version of the Ola, passing the technique through generations while the rest of the agricultural world spent decades buying equipment that delivered inferior results at 100 times the cost. You are not separate from that lineage. You are part of it. And the moment you bury your first clay pot in your garden soil, you are not doing something nostalgic or countercultural or eccentric. You are rejoining a 4,000-year conversation about how human beings can work with the earth instead of forcing the earth to comply with human convenience. That is not a small thing. In a world where 40% of the global population already faces water stress, and that number is projected to reach 65% by 2050, according to the UN World Water Development Report, the choice between a $3 clay pot and a $300 irrigation system is not just a personal finance decision. It is a statement about what kind of relationship with the natural world you want to model for everyone watching. You are not a customer in this story. You never were. You are a farmer. And farmers have always known things that salespeople don't want them to remember. Now let's make sure you actually remember how to do this. The good news is that getting started with Ola irrigation requires almost no specialized knowledge, no tools beyond a shovel, and a total investment that will likely cost you less than your last takeout meal. Let's walk through exactly what you need, what you're looking for, and how to set this up in a single afternoon. The first and most important decision is choosing the right vessel. You are looking for unglazed terracotta, and that word unglazed is non-negotiable. Glazed ceramic pots, no matter how beautiful, have their pores sealed by the firing process and will not allow water to pass through their walls. When you pick up a pot at a garden center or a thrift store, run your finger across the outer surface. Unglazed terracotta feels slightly rough, almost chalky, and has a matte appearance. Glazed ceramic feels smooth and often has a slight sheen. If you are unsure, perform a simple absorption test at home. Wet the outside of the pot and watch. Unglazed terracotta will darken immediately as water absorbs into the clay wall. A glazed pot will beat and run. This single test will save you from the most common Olla mistake. For pot size, the practical range for a home garden is between 1 liter and 4 liters. A 1 to 2 liter pot works well for raised beds and container gardens, covering a root zone radius of approximately 25 to 30 centimeters. A 3 to 4 liter pot is better suited for in-ground beds and larger plants like tomatoes, peppers, squash, or fruit trees, covering a radius of up to 45 centimeters. Standard unglazed terracotta pots in these sizes typically cost between $2 and $8 at garden centers and between $1 and $4 at thrift stores, flea markets, or ethnic grocery stores that stock traditional clay cookware. In many cases, traditional clay cooking pots, the kind used for slow cooking across South Asian, African, and Latin American cuisines, are made from exactly the right type of unglazed terracotta and work perfectly as Ollas at a fraction of the price of anything marketed specifically as garden irrigation. Once you have your vessel, you need to seal the drainage hole at the bottom if one exists. This is simple. Use a small piece of natural cork cut to size a plug of plumber's putty, or even a flat stone pressed firmly into the hole with a layer of waterproof sealant around the edge. The goal is to prevent water from draining straight down rather than diffusing through the walls. The top of the pot needs a loose cover to reduce surface evaporation from the opening. A flat piece of terracotta, a smooth stone, or even a folded piece of burlap works well. You are not sealing the top permanently. You need access to refill the pot. You are simply reducing the surface area exposed to air. Placement is where most people make their second mistake. The Ollas should be buried so that approximately 90% of the pot is below soil level, with only the neck and opening above the surface. The rim should sit just slightly above grade, high enough that soil and debris don't wash in during rainfall, but low enough that it is not acting as a funnel for surface water, which would defeat the slow release mechanism. When you dig your hole, make it slightly wider than the pot so you can pack soil firmly against the outer walls without air gaps. Air gaps between the pot wall and surrounding soil interrupt the capillary connection and dramatically reduce efficiency. Firm, consistent soil contact across the entire outer surface is what makes the system work. For spacing, place one Olla for every 60 to 90 centimeters of bed length as a general starting point, adjusting based on your soil type. Clay-heavy soils distribute moisture more slowly but more efficiently, meaning you can space pots slightly further apart. Sandy soils disperse moisture faster but lose it more quickly, so closer spacing of 45 to 60 centimeters will give better coverage. Position each pot so that your target plants sit within the coverage radius, ideally with the main stem no more than 20 to 25 centimeters from the pot wall, where capillary moisture concentration is highest. Filling the pots is straightforward. Use plain water, or if you want to feed your plants simultaneously, a very dilute liquid fertilizer solution at no more than 1/4 of the recommended concentration. Stronger solutions can clog the terracotta pores over time with mineral deposits. Fill each pot to within 3 centimeters of the top. In moderate climates with temperatures between 20 and 28 degrees Celsius, a 2-liter Olla will typically need refilling every 5 to 7 days. In hot, dry conditions above 35 degrees Celsius, check every 2 to 3 days, especially during the first 2 weeks while you are calibrating how quickly your specific soil and pot combination depletes. After one full growing season, most gardeners develop an intuitive sense of their system's rhythm and rarely need to check more than once a week. For a complete setup covering a standard 1.2 by 2.4 meter raised bed, you will need approximately 4 to 6 Ollas depending on spacing. At an average cost of $3 to $5 per pot, your total investment is between $12 and $30, a one-time cost because properly maintained unglazed terracotta lasts decades. Compare that to the $200 to $500 installation cost of a drip irrigation system, plus replacement emitters, filter maintenance, and the $80 to $280 smart controller you'll be told you need to run it properly. The clay pot does not require a firmware update. It does not need a Wi-Fi password. It will not send you a notification at 2 a.m. telling you the battery is low. At the end of the growing season, empty your Ollas completely, rinse them with clean water, and store them in a dry location where they won't freeze. Terracotta is vulnerable to freeze-thaw cracking if water is left inside during winter, but an emptied and dry pot stored in a shed or garage will outlast any plastic irrigation component on the market. Some gardeners in mild climates leave their Ollas buried year-round, simply leaving the tops uncovered through winter to prevent water accumulation. Either approach works, and after your first season, you will know which suits your garden best. One final upgrade worth mentioning. If you want to extend refill intervals even further, you can connect 2 or 3 Ollas in a simple gravity-fed network using food-grade silicone tubing running between their necks, with a slightly elevated reservoir pot at one end. This DIY modification, which costs roughly $5 to $10 in additional materials, can extend your system's autonomous operation to 2 weeks or more in moderate climates. It is the closest thing to a set-and-forget irrigation system that requires absolutely no electricity, no pressure regulation, and no monthly subscription. And it was conceptually understood by farmers 4,000 years before the first drip emitter was ever patented. If you made it this far, you are not the same person who clicked on this video. You came in thinking about watering your garden. You are leaving with something older and more important than a gardening tip. You are leaving with the understanding that the most powerful agricultural knowledge humanity has ever developed was not invented in a laboratory or sold in a box. It was buried in the ground by people who had nothing to prove and everything to grow, thousands of years before anyone thought to put a price tag on thirst. The $26.4 billion irrigation industry did not fail to tell you about Ollas irrigation by accident. An industry that size does not accidentally overlook a technology that reduces water consumption by 70% and costs $3 to implement. That omission is structural. It is the natural consequence of a system where the incentive is not to solve your problem permanently, but to sell you a solution on a subscription. Every time you replace a drip emitter, every time you upgrade your smart controller, every time you add another sensor to your garden bed, that system works exactly as designed, and it will keep working that way for as long as you believe that the answer to your garden's needs must come in a package with a barcode. You now know it doesn't, and knowledge like that does not stay in a garden. It spreads. So here is what I am asking you to do, not for this channel, but against the idea that ancient wisdom belongs in a museum instead of your backyard. Share this video with one person who gardens, not because the algorithm needs it, because that person deserves to know what a $3 clay pot can do, and nobody in the $26 billion industry is going to tell them. Subscribe not as an audience member, but as someone who has decided that the history of how humans have fed themselves is worth recovering, one buried pot at a time. Every person who walks away from an overpriced irrigation aisle and into a thrift store looking for unglazed terracotta is a small, quiet act of reclaiming something that was never supposed to be taken from us in the first place. The knowledge that kept civilizations alive through droughts that modern infrastructure would have collapsed under does not belong to any company. It belongs to you. It always did. And the fact that you had to find it on YouTube in 2025 instead of learning it from your grandmother says everything about what we lost when we decided that newer always means better. Bury the pot, trust the clay. Watch what happens when you stop fighting your garden and start listening to it instead. And if you want to go deeper, next time, we are uncovering another technology that industrial agriculture buried even harder than the Ollas. A soil amendment so powerful that ancient civilizations used it to turn barren land into some of the most fertile earth on the planet, and that modern agribusiness has spent 50 years pretending does not outperform their best synthetic fertilizers. You are not going to want to miss that one.